Why is building small fusion reactors so challenging compared to much larger ones?
It's about confining your atoms in, a point in a space. And small plasmas are actually hard to confine because the ratio of the surface area to the amount of atoms that you have in there is not so good. If you can make a larger plasma, you have more particles, more energy, and less surface area for them to escape from. In general, physics favors larger reactors. And then bear in mind, the middle of your plasma is like as hot as the sun. So this is like the temperature range of the entire universe. And the more you try and squash that, the harder it is to maintain this temperature gradient between insanely hot and insanely cold.
Who is going to win the fusion race?
If you're pouring billions, maybe even one day trillions into these experiments, you want them to kind of work. And so that's why we keep pushing on this path of the Tokamak, because we know it's going to work and we can just make a slightly bigger one and it will probably keep working. What's exciting about startups with a much higher risk appetite is that they can pursue entirely new directions that wouldn't be possible, where you have to kind of guarantee that something's going to at least give you good results in the lab.
Now, $1 billion question. What are your predictions for the next 10, 20, 30 years, and where would you put your money?
We will likely see big results from Tokamaks from Commonwealth fusions when they complete their arc reactor, and as well as from ITER when eventually, perhaps, it gets finished. And we will likely see more results from Stellarators because the extrapolation from where they are today to where they need to be, again, is much smaller than for other designs. For the wacky designs, it's hard for anyone to call. My hope is that we'll see some great results. As I say, my take is that I think before 2050, fusion will be possible. The question is whether it's cheap enough.
Welcome to the Climate Insiders podcast, where top climate thinkers, entrepreneurs, and investors share revolutionary ideas and insights. Tune in to learn from the visionaries shaping a sustainable future. Let's dive in. All right, well, let's switch now to another topic that is equally as controversial, where there's a lot of skepticism, and it's been the case for decades, is nuclear fusion. This is equally as moonshot as hydrogen, if not more. I would love you to take another 15 minutes, kind of giving us the rundown of all the different technologies out there. And then I have a lot of questions for you.
Sure. I mean, definitely more moonshot than hydrogen. We know we can do hydrogen. It's just expensive. We don't even know if we can do fusion yet. Well, we think we can, but let's get into it. So a common kind of misconception about fusion is that we'll kind of unlock fusion one day and there will be kind of a single breakthrough. And from that point on, we will be able to roll out fusion around the world, and we'll have this kind of untapped energy source that will solve climate change and all our problems. And today I want to firstly explain why that's not quite right, and secondly, break down what it would actually mean to have a breakthrough in fusion, or the requirements that fusion must check off to be a viable energy source. And so I'm going to break that down into 5 levels that fusion must achieve in order to become a viable energy source. Before I go through the levels, just a kind of quick primer on fusion and how it works. And firstly, on the basics, we're talking about nuclear power here, so I just want to explain fusion versus fission, which is our existing nuclear power. So when you see nuclear power stations that exist today, or that have existed in the past, or sometimes caused accidents in the past, those are all nuclear fission. And nuclear fission means breaking atoms apart. And the whole goal of nuclear power is to make medium-sized atoms. So if you have a large atom and you split it into medium atoms, then you produce energy. That's fission. If you take small atoms and you fuse them together to make medium atoms, that's fusion. And creating medium atoms releases energy. So that's 2 different ways of nuclear power. So how does fusion actually work? You have to combine 2 atoms together. So you have to mash them together at high speed. And in order for them to fuse, they need to be traveling really fast. And you want as many atoms colliding as possible to maximize your chances of them fusing. And so that means when you're building a fusion reactor, there are 2 things that you need. First is you need atoms that are traveling really fast to bump into each other. And second thing is that you need them to be contained in a small amount of space, because you can imagine otherwise they just disappear. You want them to be contained together and bumping into each other. Atoms moving fast means that they're hot. That's kind of what temperature is. It's atoms with a lot of energy moving really fast. So the tricky bit is, how do you confine your atoms in a space? If I've got atoms that are like several million degrees, they're just going to melt through anything that I try and hold them in. So the key question of fusion is, how do you contain atoms in a small amount of space without them melting something? And so the approach to confinement is how we categorize different types of fusion reactor. And there are 2 main types of confinement. So the first one is magnetic confinement. This is where you use magnets to hold your atoms in place so that they don't escape. And this is what a lot of the fusion experiments that we've built in the past have been, and where a lot of our results have come from. So the most common form of magnetic fusion reactor, or the most popular form, is called a tokamak. It looks like a donut, and essentially your atoms just whiz round in a slightly funky loop on the inside. And so your magnets hold them in place. They just spin round and round and round and bump into each other. And so a lot of our understanding for fusion comes from these experiments in tokamaks, and they've been the most successful. They're our most promising lead to developing fusion soon, though that's got some heavy caveats. One famous fusion tokamak project is called ITER, IETR. It's being built in France. It's this huge collaboration between lots of countries, and it's pretty huge. There is like the biggest, the magnet that they will use to create fusion is like the biggest superconducting magnet ever built. It's built in a vacuum, and the vessel that they create the vacuum in weighs as much as the Eiffel Tower. It's a ginormous experiment. The second type of confinement is called inertial confinement. And in this one, you're basically just trying to take the atoms by surprise. So you're essentially trying to heat them up so quickly that they fuse before they can like escape and run away. And so usually you do this with like lasers, beams, and rays to heat them up as quickly as you can. And we'll come back to some inertial confinement experiments in a bit. But now I want to go into the levels. So the 5 levels that you need to achieve before you've unlocked fusion power. So level 1 is the only level that we've done so far. And that is achieving more energy output than energy input. So you can imagine if you have a fusion reactor, firstly, you need to heat up your atoms so that they can be traveling fast, and that requires some energy input. Once they've heated up, they will fuse and release some energy, and that's the energy output, that's the good stuff. And my fusion reactor is obviously only any good if it's producing more energy output than energy input. And we measure this with something called Q. Q is the ratio of output to input. So if Q is more than 1, your reactor is happy days, producing power. If it's less than 1, it's no good. And there are only a few times in history that we've achieved Q is greater than 1. So first is when we were building like thermonuclear bombs and fusion bombs, hydrogen bombs. And then the first non-bomb Q greater than 1 happened in 2002, at which point there was this facility in California which had, it's pretty crazy. They have warehouses and warehouses of lasers. This is an inertial confinement scheme that zaps a tiny point that's like less than the size of a pea. And through zapping this fuel pellet, they've been zapping different pellets for decades, or just over a decade, trying to get this to work. And it finally worked. So they managed to release more energy output than input, which is amazing. Great experiment. Not actually a facility for investigating nuclear power, but actually just nuclear physics in general. It's funded for weapons development, but overall, an amazing milestone. And so we've now hit level 1. We've achieved more energy output than input. Level 2 takes this concept of energy output and energy input and makes it even harder. So the thing that they achieved in California only applies to the plasma itself, plasma being the soup of atoms that we're heating up. If I actually take into account all the energy that I had to put in to run my whole plant or run the whole building, I didn't actually get more energy out than in. So for a fusion power plant to be viable, I want my building as a whole, my fusion power plant, to generate more output than input. And there are lots of other things in that building which will use electricity. For example, the energy required to heat up the lasers or your magnets or this kind of stuff, and also your efficiency of taking the heat which has been created by fusion, if you're using a certain type of fuel, the easiest type of fuel, and converting that to electricity. So there are various losses here which you need to overcome. You need to make even more energy to compensate for them. And if all of that is done successfully, then you achieve level 2. So now we'll move on to level 3, which is that now you have a reactor that's spitting out more power or more energy. You want that to actually be in the form of useful electricity. So something that you can actually use on the grid. Most fusion experiments so far have been pulsed experiments. They've been very short. So if you look at tokamaks, they're often designed to operate briefly. One reason for that is because they essentially have a magnet which can only be turned on temporarily. And you can operate them without that, but it's just harder. And for inertial confinement, where you're zapping something with the laser, like blowing something up with the laser is very pulsed. You can't do that continuously. And so there the question is, can you keep on like exploding things quickly enough to have like a continuous output of power? And the answer may be yes. And that's kind of like how a car engine works, is repeated explosions. But it's really hard when you have this huge level of energy and this incredibly complex setup. The other thing that you need for level 3 is having an output that's electricity, not heat. So most designs for fusion reactors that use the easiest fuel, they just produce heat. And that's fine, but it's essentially a big kettle. And the question is then, how do you turn that heat into electricity? We can do that in the same way that we do it for coal plants, gas plants, nuclear plants. But again, you're going to lose half of your energy. All right, level 4 is achieving a sustainable fuel supply for your reactor. There are a few different types of fuel that you can use for your fusion reactor. They involve different combinations of atoms that we can bash together, but there is an easiest type, and it's easiest type by far. It's a combination of 2 specific types of hydrogen atom, and it releases the most energy at the lowest temperature, which is still many millions of degrees. And it's just easier to cause this type of reaction to happen than the other fuels. But the problem is that this fuel combination called DT, the T stands for tritium, which is really hard to get hold of. So tritium is our kind of critical ingredient in achieving the easiest path to fusion, but it's radioactive, which means that it's constantly turning into other elements. So our tritium supply in the world at the moment is roughly 40 kilograms, and it's constantly disappearing. So like it's got a half-life of 12 years, which means if I leave some tritium in my basement and come back 12 years later, half of it will be something else. So it's constantly disappearing. You're constantly losing tritium, and that's really difficult. For example, ITER, the experiment in France, wants to use 12 kilograms of tritium. And bear in mind, we've only got 40 worldwide. Most of it is currently produced by fission reactors in Canada. They're going to shut down at some point, and we're not sure. We might build some more in other countries, Romania and other places, but it's kind of uncertain. So this is really difficult. And so one thing that your reactor needs to be able to do is to create more tritium than it uses. Otherwise, you're just going to burn through your tritium really quickly, and it's going to be useless. And this is actually a major unknown point of fusion reactors, because we haven't really tested ways to recover tritium from a fusion reactor. And the main idea is that you surround your fusion reactor in something called a breeding blanket, which is a horrible name. And as particles from your reaction hit the breeding blanket, they make more tritium. But this is a really intense engineering challenge, because in real time, you've got to be like pulling the tritium out of your blanket. So you can imagine like liquid lithium and lead mixture in the walls of your reactor, which is being real-time processed to get the tritium out and then put it back in as fuel. And like at ITER, this plant in France, their tritium processing building is like a 7-story building just to process tritium. It's really intense, and like no fusion startup is building a tritium breeding blanket, because it's really hard, and they'll just kind of treat it as we'll figure it out later, because it's really difficult. We think we can do it on paper, but in practice, it's very unproven. And then the final level, level 5, is that your fusion power plant is cost competitive with other energy sources. Fusion is probably going to be quite expensive, because it's a very complicated machine, and you're competing with things like solar and batteries, which are mass manufacturable. We can churn them out. The more we produce, the more the cost comes down. The curves the learning rates are insane, and they keep getting cheaper every year. And so you're in competition with that. And it's not unreasonable to draw the parallel to nuclear fission. And you can ask the question, why don't we have more nuclear fission in the world? And some of it is because of cultural stigma and accidents. Some of it is because people don't like the idea of radioactive waste. But a lot of it is just cost. Like in the UK, nuclear fission is quite popular. We could build more nuclear plants if we wanted to, but we don't, primarily because they're expensive. Like we're building Hinkley Point C at the moment, which is like the most expensive construction project in Europe. Over time, over budget, as always. And nuclear fission is just extremely complex to build. People try and mass manufacture fission reactors using small modular reactors. That's really difficult. It's not been going so well for a lot of the big companies that are doing that, because fundamentally, nuclear power is very hard to do compactly. It's very hard to mass manufacture and get those learning rate cost declines that you get with wind and solar. So my personal opinion is that fusion will definitely be possible. I think we're going to crush levels 1 to 4. We'll definitely do it before 2050. Maybe I shouldn't say definitely. I think it's likely to happen before 2050. I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic that there is so much stuff that we don't know and so much possibility for us to discover new ways of doing things. But nuclear power will probably remain expensive for a long while. So the question is not, will it be possible? The question is, will we afford to do it, and we build it anyway? So I'll leave it there.
Looking to make smart investments in climate tech? Subscribe to the Saturday Climate Insider newsletter. Every Saturday, I'll send you one actionable tip to navigate the climate tech investment landscape. Join over 3,500 investors who are already gaining exclusive insights and strategies. Subscribe today. Amazing. Thanks for laying out all the foundations. Now, let me go through rapid fire again on a number of areas. So, number one, you mentioned small modular reactors, but the question is always small versus large. Why is building small fusion reactors so challenging compared to much larger ones?
Great question. So once again, it's about confining your atoms in a point in a space. And small plasmas are actually hard to confine because the ratio of the surface area to the amount of atoms that you have in there is not so good. If you can make a larger plasma, you have more particles, more energy, and less surface area for them to escape from. So in general, physics favors larger reactors, and that's why if you look at like the experiments which have produced the biggest results, they've been getting bigger over time, and that's why ITER is like absolutely colossal. The other thing about fusion, for magnetic confinement fusion, we use superconducting magnets, which have to be chilled to minus 269 degrees Celsius. So they're really cold. And then bear in mind, the middle of your plasma is like as hot as the sun. So this is like the temperature range of the entire universe. And the more you try and squash that, the harder it is to maintain this temperature gradient between insanely hot and insanely cold. So that's just extremely hard to do. Another reason why, bigger reactors are easier. The other reason is that you need a lot of auxiliary stuff around your reactor. So you need to shield it because whilst fusion isn't as radioactive as fission, it still produces radioactive particles. And so at least if you're using DT, the easiest type of fuel. And so you want to shield humans from the particles. And you might need 0.5 meter of shielding. Again, you need this breathing blanket to absorb your neutrons to make tritium. And you need a whole tritium processing setup. So this is big. And so it's unlikely we'll be walking around with a fusion reactor in our pocket or cell phone. So
you've mentioned ITER a number of times, and this is a full government-funded project. It's enormous. The scope is it's counted in the decades and not necessarily in the years. But we've seen an emergence of the private sector and an explosion of projects like Commonwealth Fusion. A dozen by now of really well-funded projects.
Yeah.
Who is going to win the fusion race?
I don't know enough. That's an impossible bet to call, but I am certain that it will be helped immensely by the startups that you mentioned. And Commonwealth has raised $2 billion. It's an insanely well-capitalized and extremely high density of talent working on it. And if we were to just pursue fusion in ITER-style projects internationally, we will not get anywhere for decades because they are important and they allow us to do a level of scale and cooperation that other projects don't, but they're too slow. And so one characteristic of projects like ITER is that you want your project to succeed if you're creating a collaboration with 7 different countries, one of which is the EU. And if you're pouring billions, maybe even one day trillions into these experiments, you want them to kind of work. And so that's why we keep pushing on this path of the tokamak, because we know it's going to work and we can just make a slightly bigger one and it will probably keep working. What's exciting about startups with a much higher risk appetite is that they can pursue entirely new directions that wouldn't be possible, where you have to kind of guarantee that something's going to at least give you good results in a lab. So yeah, I'm really excited about startups. There are so many different approaches to fusion. There are approaches that don't use DT fuel. There are approaches that don't use tokamaks or inertial confinement. There are a ton of wacky stuff. And I'm really happy that we're pursuing all the wacky stuff alongside the mainstream stuff.
Enjoying the podcast? Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Click the subscribe button now and stay updated with the latest in climate innovation. Is there evidence today as one camp seem to be ahead of the other or could deliver higher economic viability? Between Tokamaks, Stellarators, which is another form of magnetic confinement, or laser-based?
Yeah, great question. It's too early to call the race. All of our evidence suggests that if we wanted to really, if you had kind of infinite money and with the knowledge that we have today, produce fusion tomorrow, we would use a tokamak because we know the most about it. We have thrown a lot of fusion reactor designs at the wall over the past, since the 50s, and most of them have failed because the thing about fusion is you might have a reactor design that works great on paper, you try it in the lab, it works great, but the amount of difference in parameters between something that's as hot as the sun and something that works in the lab is so big that as you try and climb between that, inevitably you find something that just kills your project. So there are so many fusion reactors that worked great on paper and worked great as they got kind of hot and kind of dense. And the closer you get to the actual conditions you would need to make power, there are just so many unknown unknowns as you climb that chart. The likelihood of you dropping out is very big. So really, the people that have got very high on that chart in terms of getting close to the conditions that you need to make fusion, a lot of them are tokamaks. A lot of them are stellarators, which are different to tokamaks, but also not so dissimilar. They're still magnetic confinement going around in a loop. So yeah, there are these pathways that we know a lot about compared to others, which is one challenge for the wacky designs.
The research has been going on for decades. And one thing in the recent years has altered this research and really acted as an inflection point is the role of machine learning and AI. Do you think machine learning will accelerate fusion by a huge margin, or there are still enormous limitations in the design and leveraging machine learning for simulations, for example?
There is definitely a huge role for AI to play in fusion. The reason for that is that fusion is so complex that there are different topographies of reactors or designs that we might not be even able to conceive of as humans. And so using AI, maybe not today, but maybe in several years' time, is really exciting in exploring the design space, because one thing that's really notable about fusion is that there's this huge parameter space of all the things you could change about a reactor, even just a tokamak, from different, the radius to the size to like the current, the profiles that you put through it. There are so many things to change, and we've explored such a tiny sliver of it. Machine learning can help us explore that parameter space in a simulated way that's much faster than what we can do at the moment. So that's great. Having spoken to some people who know much more about this than me, I think people have expressed skepticism that AI will ever completely design a fusion reactor. One reason for that is that it's still kind of radioactive. And so you can't have a machine design system that does this. There's always got to be an element of human design to designing a fusion reactor. And there are limits. The space of nuclear power engineering is still extremely complex, and there's a lot that we need to do as humans.
Let's speak briefly about the energy policy and the regulatory environment. how should energy policy play a role to really accelerate the deployment and development of fusion, in your opinion?
Great question. So historically, we funded fusion for a while in the 20th century, and then it's kind of been flat for a long while. And then now it's peaking a little bit more, as you say, through private sector. But there is a kind of simple answer to this, which is that the timeline to fusion is not measured in years. It is measured in dollars. If we wanted to achieve radically faster progress in fusion, we could, simply by doing more experiments, trying more things, and developing the talent and the capital pool that's working in fusion. Energy policy as regards to actually deploying fusion is too premature because fusion isn't at that stage yet. We're not remotely close to the point where we can actually deploy fusion on the grid. So most policy has to be addressed towards R&D and getting the best results from science.
Now, $1 billion question, again, putting on the investor hat on. What are your predictions for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And where would you put your money? On Tokamaks, Stellarators, laser-based fusion, or completely different sectors, or subsectors? We
will likely see big results from Tokamaks, from Commonwealth fusions when they complete their arc reactor, and as well as from ITER when eventually, perhaps, it gets finished. And we will likely see more results from Stellarators because the extrapolation from where they are today to where they need to be, again, is much smaller than for other designs. For the wacky designs, it's really it's hard for me to call. It's hard for anyone to call. And my hope is that we'll see some great results, but you never know. And as I say, my take is that I think before 2050, fusion will be possible. The question is whether it's cheap enough.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been really insightful. Appreciate you sharing all the knowledge with us.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming on Climate Insiders.
Pleasure.
Ready to make a substantial impact on our planet's future? Join the Climate Insiders community today. We are a group of investors committed to supporting bold, moonshot startups that are tackling climate change head-on. Become part of a new generation of climate investors and help us create a sustainable future. Visit climateinsiders.com to join now.